One of Emperor Palpatine's greatest frustrations with Darth Vader during their early years of ruling the Galactic Empire was his apprentice's lacking qualities of being an effective right-hand man. Although Vader was loyal and expertly served as an enforcer in conquering resisting planets, when it came time to govern them, he often made things worse by his narrow vision of simply killing everything with his lightsaber, rather than using deception and political manipulation to keep Imperial subjects in line. For Palpatine wanted his apprentice to be a ruler, not just a warrior. This was especially important during the early years of the Empire's reign, as the expanding Imperial military was simply not at the strength it needed to be, where direct control over systems was sustainable. As a result, an aura of legitimacy was required to be established to ensure potentially unruly systems stayed in line. It wasn't until Vader's mission to the planet Vaklin that the Sith Lord finally learned how to fill the role as a ruler. Vaklin was a backwater world that struggled economically for much of its history. Despite this, it held vital resources that the Empire required, and its location within the Inner Rim meant it was suitable to become a potential economic hub that the Imperials hoped to establish by cooperating with the locals. However, the people living on Vaklin held strong pro-Jedi sentiments, to the point of them constructing various statues, gardens, and even a large temple in their honor. This problem only amplified when 3 surviving Jedi came to the planet and formed an insurgency to fend off Imperial rule. When Vader first arrived to deal with the rebels, he relied on his previous methods of just killing them into submission. Yet no matter how many insurgents he killed, including one of the Jedi leaders, the planetary rebellion only gained more support from the locals. After a while, Vader held a meeting with his Imperial officers to discuss a new military strategy. As the meeting progressed, Vader became frustrated as the officers started to offer up alternative solutions to fighting, with the Sith Lord deciding to double down on continuing to use direct force instead. This time, after having captured the second Jedi leader of the insurgency, Vader decided to use torture as a means of forcing their submission. Once again, this did nothing but encourage the rebels to stage more aggressive attacks, with the main Imperial headquarters being eventually leveled following a massive bombing and rescue mission. Although Vader and the Imperials were able to fend off the attackers and prevent them from freeing the captive Jedi, who died during the skirmish, it resulted in them temporarily relocating to a Star Destroyer in orbit while their planet-side base was being rebuilt, an act which once again bolstered the morale of the rebels. Upon learning of the events taking place on Vaklin, Palpatine directly contacted Vader to scold him over his failures. Despite his attempts of trying to spin the recent actions as victories by mentioning the deaths of the 2 Jedi leaders by his hand, it was when he suggested that if the insurgency did not crumble following the defeat of the last remaining Jedi, that a full-scale orbital bombardment would take care of their problem. This comment set Palpatine off, requiring him to remind his apprentice once again that killing the entire planet's population was foolish and counterproductive to their long-term goals of ruling the galaxy. Having his patience pushed to its limit, Palpatine threatened that if his apprentice couldn't learn to think as a ruler, that he would start assigning him less duties with him in a leadership position. Understanding he had one last chance to prove to his master that he deserved to stand at his side, Vader finally swallowed his pride and opened himself to listening to alternative solutions. He did this by holding a one-on-one meeting with an Imperial Security Bureau agent named Onia Namada, who had a good pulse on the feelings of the locals after having formed friendly relationships with many of them, while Vader was fighting the rebels in the outskirts of the main cities. Using her knowledge of the people's attitudes towards the Jedi and the things they wanted, Vader and Namada formed a new plan to finally put an end to the Vaklin insurgency once and for all. The first stage of the plan was removing all cultural traces of the Jedi from the planet, which included destroying their statues and shrines from city plazas, as well as the Grand Temple built out in the mountain. The second stage was deeply investing in the planet's economy by constructing education centers for the children and offering job opportunities for those who had been historically cast aside. While these first 2 stages led to progress, with the populace finally starting to become compliant due to the genuine improvements in their living standards, it was the third stage that would finally secure the Imperials' hold over the planet, the eradication of the people's hope of the Jedi ever returning as the heroes they once knew. This final act required Vader to face off against the final remaining Jedi leader of the insurgency, but instead of trying to kill him, The Sith Lord instead toyed with his opponent until he was led into a cave system. The Jedi did this because the cave was filled with flammable gas, which prevented both of them from using their lightsabers in combat, hoping that would give him the advantage in their fight. However, the gas was also toxic, and if inhaled long enough, could cause serious brain damage. Because Vader was protected by his helmet and suit, he was in no danger, but the Jedi was. Nonetheless, Vader was able to overpower the Jedi despite neither having access to their lightsabers, but didn't kill him when he had the chance. Instead, having injured his foe, Vader left him in the cave where the Jedi continued to inhale the toxic gas. Eventually, the Jedi got out, but had lost his mind and began to hallucinate once he reached the city for aid, with most of the locals knowing who he was due to their past support of him, yet seeing him in such a pathetic and defeated state. All respect they held for him vanished. Their views of him got so low that when Namada shot the Jedi as he was desperately seeking help from a former rebel ally, the people around publicly denounced him as a drunken thug, rather than own up that he was once the Jedi they all looked up to for hope of freeing them from their Imperial occupiers. And with that, Vaklin finally submitted to the Empire, with the insurgency ultimately crumbling and the populace becoming loyal, productive servants of the new order. Impressed with his apprentice starting to learn, Palpatine praised Vader for his successful efforts and his start into maturing into a proper right hand he can rely on. However, in spite of this growth, Vader still held on to his need to prove himself against his Jedi foes, but came to understand he had to put his master's wants before his own if he wanted to remain at his side. For despite all of Palpatine's talk of them ruling side by side, Vader understood he was still only the apprentice and lived to serve.